I'm going to talk a little bit about the nature of truth and some of its enemies. And by the end of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of Richard Rorty, who is famous, amongst other things, for saying that only a metaphysical prig believes in truth anymore. Well, I find myself a kind of prig, I suppose, in spite of having written a book about lust. And what I want to urge is that you can believe in truth without being a metaphysical prig. You just have to be a prig. So that's going to be the plot. The setting against which I'm going to talk, I'm not going to read out all this material, partly because it makes up a book on truth, but I'm going to summarize the plot as it leads up to the discussion of Richard Rorty. Well, the setting is a very old one. It's one that you meet, for example, in the dialogue of Theaetetus, in which we imagine a confrontation between relativists and absolutists. The relativist is the kind of sneery person that you meet in the marketplace who thinks that a lot of our talk about truth, objectivity, knowledge, talk about scientific rationality perhaps, a lot of such discourse is in fact to be seen simply as the putting on of masks, of theatrical guises, or of the adoption of a rhetorical pose. It's a way of, it's a vocabulary to be used to persuade others of our opinion. In other words, the primary usage of those terms is in connection with power and persuasion. I'll sometimes talk of that as a postmodernist view. I take it that's a harmless enough label, although of course you could dispute whether particular postmodernists like Foucault or Derrida or Lyotard actually conform exactly to the description. Against the relativist, you become the absolutists who think that truth, on the contrary, is a deity worth worshipping. Truth is real, truth is absolute, truth is something that you must worship. A falling away from truth is a failure. Truth exerts a demand upon us, and so on. In the dialogue in the Theaetetus, of course, Socrates is the champion of truth, the absolutist position, and he confronts Theodorus and Protagoras, a disciple of Protagoras, who takes the other view. So you've got, in a nutshell, on the one hand, philosophers believing that truth deserves, as it were, dignities and robes of state. Those are the absolutists. And on the other hand, you've got relativists who think that it, when we talk about truth, we're basically putting on something more like a theatrical costume, a set of masks. I believe that the sides in this dispute tend to talk past each other, and a lot of the argument that is adduced on one side or the other therefore misses its target. I've got a story. I have put this story in print in my little book, Being Good, so I'm afraid the happy few of you in the audience who may have read that book will have to bear with me for a moment, and I'll be telling you a story you know. But I've got a story which illustrates the way the two sides talk past each other, which I very much like. And it's a true story. It happened to a friend of mine, the distinguished philosopher of Lord Jeremy Waldron, actually, who was at a think tank in Princeton on ethics. And it was a condition of his fellowship at this institute that he attend all the talks, or all the particular talks that the institute put on. And one night they put on for the rest of the university, or perhaps the general public, a dialogue between proponents of the world's great religions. Jeremy had no particular interest in this topic, but he had to go along as a condition of his fellowship. So he went along, and sure enough, there was a little line-up, and they let everybody have their go. And so, as it were, first off, let's say the Hindu went, and he talked about karma and the reincarnation of the spirit and the number of lives you had to live and how you could eventually free yourself from the cycle and so on. And everybody gave a tremendous round of applause and said, you know, if that works for you, that's great. And then the Buddhist went, and he talked about the corruption of life by desire and the way to release yourself from that by the noble truths and the Eightfold Way and so on. At the end of that, everybody said, wow, tremendous applause. If that works for you, that's great. And so it went on. Eventually, the Catholic priest had his say, and he talked about the fall of mankind, the Garden of Eden, the expulsion from the garden, the serpent, the redemption of the world through Jesus Christ, and so forth. And they all said, oh, wow, terrific. If that works for you, that's great. And he thumped the table and said, no, it's not a question of if it works for me. It's the true word of the living God. And if you don't believe it, you're all damned to hell. And they all said, wow, terrific. If that works... well, that's what I mean by the two sides talking past each other. The ancient Greeks had a nice motto, saying that you can give something with the right hand and yet it is received with the left, and I think that's what the story illustrates. So how do we get past the opposition? How do we argue about it? How do we argue ourselves out of it? Well, I think that in recent philosophy of truth, far and away the most promising suggestion has been to go minimalist. And I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that, or deflationist. Some of you will have read the writings of people like Stephen Leeds or Paul Horwich, and you'll know what I'm talking about. But in a nutshell, it goes something like this. Along comes someone like Pilate, Pontius Pilate, and says, what is truth? And everybody goes sort of dizzy, and you look to the philosopher to provide a suitably abstract and highfalutin answer. The minimalist says you shouldn't answer Pilate, or rather, if you answer Pilate, your answer should take the form of a question, which is, what are you interested in? So basically, you throw the question, what is truth, back, until the person who's interlocuting you, who's asking the question, gives you an example. He says, well, I'm interested in the question of whether penguins fly. So you say, okay, well, the truth would consist in penguins flying. See, in other words, you just repeat the issue. That's very disappointing, of course. But the point of deflationism or minimalism is that disappointing answer is all you should get. It's all you should expect, and it's all you're going to get. It has a number of consequences, one of which is that when we talk in terms of truth, we're not elevating ourselves at all. We're not taking up, as it were, a God's eye viewpoint or an Archimedean viewpoint outside an issue. If I say, I really want to know whether it's true that penguins fly, I'm saying no more than I really want to know whether penguins fly. And that's a perfectly straightforward empirical question. If I've defined a good issue, then the issue is the issue. And there's no question of my trying to adopt a stance, which is the peculiar privilege of the philosopher. There may be something priggish, this is where priggishness comes back, in being particularly interested in a particular issue, but there's nothing metaphysically necessarily priggish about it. If you're interested in whether penguins fly, good for you, and if you've got the money, you can go to the Antarctic and conduct some observations, or you can look it up in encyclopedias or do whatever appears appropriate. So the minimalist says there's no general problem about truth. Of course, there may be problems that arise in connection with particular sentences. There might be sentences that don't define an issue, in which case you can't play the game I just played. You can't deflate it and say, I know what the issue of truth is, it's that P, because you haven't got a proposition to wheel up about which you're inquiring. But when you do, the minimalist says the issue is the issue, and anything else is a distraction. So you're neither putting on robes of state, nor are you adopting a rhetorical posture or putting on a theatrical mask. Both the absolutist and the relativist thought there was a space for theory when there's none. And that is the minimalist or deflationist point. It's sometimes thought that minimalism and deflationism take away a certain kind of ambitions that we might have. And this is, I think, possibly the only point of contact I've got with this conference, at least in its connection with value. It's sometimes thought that minimalism or deflationism take away any idea that truth is intrinsically valuable, or that you can care about truth. So, for example, if you think of Winston in George Orwell's 1984, or you think of the kind of morality exhibited by Primo Levi, then these people care about truth and they go to the stake for truth. And it's thought that the minimalist somehow doesn't allow that. How can truth remain an ideal if there's no such robust abstract property? That, I think, it's a natural question, but I don't think the challenge is unanswerable. In fact, I think the challenge can fairly easily be answered. What the minimalist says is, as usual, you tell me the issue. Suppose the issue is whether penguins waddle. Then you care about the truth if you care about whether penguins waddle. And you care, for example, about ancillary things like only saying that penguins waddle if penguins do waddle, or believing that penguins waddle if and only if penguins waddle. In other words, you've got a way of saying for each sentence what caring about its truth amounts to. And you can then turn that into a schema. Somebody can be said in general to care about truth. If he cares about satisfying the schema, I believe that P, if and only if P, to the maximum number of times. Or if he feels guilty when he turns out to have satisfied an instance of the schema, I believe P, although not P. Or if he's prepared to put a lot of effort into maximizing either the proportion of times or the number of times that he satisfies that schema. And since the schema, none of its instances mentions truth, you don't need a robust metaphysical property of truth to give sense to Winston's concern or to Primo Levi's concern. So I don't think it's true that minimalism takes away your right to care about truth, as you should. Well, now, is it then the case that the relativist, for example, has to slink back into silence? Does this kind of thought, the minimalist thought, defeat any relativist leanings anyone might have? I think it's true that it defeats, for instance, the moral relativist, at least the what's sometimes called the sophomoric moral relativist that you meet on the street, as it were, or in the freshman seminar room. Suppose you've got a moral issue. I'll take the example of whether fox hunting should be banned, because this was a big issue in Britain quite recently, whether hunting with foxes should be disallowed. And you can imagine a proponent of one side or the other. Somebody says that it should be allowed, and somebody else says that it shouldn't. So I suppose I'm arguing with somebody, we'll call him Genghis, who Genghis thinks that fox hunting is a jolly good thing, and I think it should be banned. And now imagine the relativist, Rosie, coming along. And Rosie says something like, you two, you're always banging on about this issue as if there's a truth about it. You ought to realize that it's true for you, Simon, that fox hunting ought to be banned, but it's true for Genghis that it ought not to be banned. You relativize truth and just stop bickerings, shut up about it. Something like that. For the relativist, there's my truth, your truth, his truth. Minimalism, I think, stops that and stops it properly. It stops it properly because it gives no meaning to my truth, your truth, except, of course, I believe that fox hunting ought to be banned, and Genghis believes that it oughtn't to be banned, but we already knew that. That's why we've got an opposition, a debate on. I think in silencing Rosie and giving her nothing to say, minimalism has it's a plus, it's an advantage to minimalism that it does that, because I think you can see that she is just actually a distraction. Because what goes on after she's had her say, after she said, oh, look, it's true for Genghis that fox hunting ought to be banned, but it's true for you that it ought not to be banned, and it's true for you that it ought to be banned. What's supposed to go on? Are we supposed to just fall over and say, fine, we'll agree to differ? But of course we don't. If I agree to differ with Genghis, that's functionally equivalent to tolerating his fox hunting, which is what I was against. But why should I change my mind? Why should I cease from being against it and start tolerating it because of anything Rosie has said? She hasn't said anything that makes fox hunting a jot more permissible, or she hasn't changed the colours in which it might appear to me. She hasn't done, in other words, she hasn't engaged with any reasons I might have for thinking that fox hunting ought to be banned, nor has she engaged with any reasons Cengiz might have for thinking it ought not to. In other words, her contribution seems to be just a distraction. I don't think that's always so. I think a contribution of that kind might not be a distraction if, for example, there's not a real issue, or if the two protagonists ought to stop bickering for some other reason. Most likely that they haven't framed an issue properly, and I think many issues about values are not framed properly. For example, if you and I go to the art gallery and I say Rembrandt is a greater painter than Vermeer, and you say no, Vermeer is a greater painter than Rembrandt, there may be a point in somebody who comes along to, as it were, try to stop us from bickering, because very probably, put in those terms, the issue is not worth discussing. You can discuss all sorts of issues about the relationship between Rembrandt and Vermeer, but if you put it into terms of which is the greater painter, I don't think you'll get anywhere, and I don't think that without a lot of clarification you'll be defining an issue worth talking about, and therefore not an issue worth bickering about. So I don't think relativism is always a distraction, or merely a distraction, but I think in cases where we have an issue which we have to sort out, then the motto is the issue, and these remarks, purporting to be remarks about the nature of truth, are irrelevant and distractions. Okay, what about, though, the movement of modern thought, the movement I vaguely pointed to as postmodernism, which you may think is unlikely to be silenced by the kinds of remarks I've made so far. Minimalism about truth gets us so far, but the postmodernist climate, as it were, I think is not one that we're going to change simply by insisting upon it. I think the postmodernist climate can best be summarized. Well, I quite like a few years ago there was a very indiscreet and talkative butler, a man called Paul Burrell, who had been Princess Diana's butler, and he spilled the beans to all the newspapers for considerable sums of money. And he said, apropos of Diana's death, that the Queen had said to him, "There are dark forces at work of which we know nothing." Well, I rather doubt whether the Queen said any such thing. But if she did, that she's in effect giving us a motto of postmodernism, because I think the motivation, as it were, the steam behind a lot of what you read about the decline of truth, or the absence of objectivity and so on, the steam is given, I think, by the thought, voiced in different ways, of course, at the beginning of modernism by people like Freud or Nietzsche, and then carried on through into almost everything in the 20th century, that our sayings and our perceptions of the world will inevitably be the result of a process of acculturation, about which we know very little, and whose effects upon us we cannot discount for. We, in some sense, cannot step outside our own skins and get rid of the bias that would be brought with our interests, our vocabularies, our saliences, our ways of looking at things. Looked at like that, it's not true that postmodernism is the private property of weird continental philosophers of the kind that some of the graduate students in this room may suffer from. It's also there very, very firmly in the Anglo-American culture. If we think of a Garden of Eden, a golden age, for example, sometime perhaps in the heyday of positivism, although actually this is historically too simple, but a golden age would be one where you've got, as it were, determinate experience, you've got a determinate way of taking experience to build theory, if not necessarily an algorithm for creating theory, at least a set of rational procedures for assessing theory, and you've got determinate meaning, so that you can pass on the results of any theorizing you've done and expect them to transmit without distortion. If you think about a picture something like that, and perhaps with other components as well, for example, reliable logic, a priori certitude in various ways, then I think you can see that everything that happened in post-war analytic or Anglo-American philosophy, everything that, as it were, got brand names attached to it, was in effect a dissolution of that sunny picture. In other words, our expulsion from paradise was complete. You think of Sellers as attacking the myth of the given, undermining the sense that observation somehow unproblematically or directly plugged you into the fact observed. You think of Quine as undermining the determinacy of meaning, so that the idea that your words bore certain meaning which you could rely upon transmitting to other people, that idea became attacked. Quine also, of course, attacking the notion of the a priori. You got Wittgenstein stressing the role of human nature, or human and perhaps a cultured nature, in determining what counted for us as going on the same way. That's a very abstract way of putting what Wittgenstein was aiming at in the rule-following considerations. It chimes in with the way Goodman thought, but I think it's accurate enough. And of course, eventually you've got Thomas Kuhn telling us that science itself is not so much a matter of rationality, but a matter of putting on a particular set of spectacles, or seeing natural phenomena through a certain set of paradigms which could shift. And the shift would be, as it were, a question of dark forces. It'd be a question of social, political, other needs coming to mind, other forces coming to mind, and that would change the concepts with which we thought about nature. Well, I think all those are ways, if you see them together, the similarity I want to point out is that they're ways of undermining the sunny epistemological picture, which perhaps the positivists were the last people to express. I think against that background, it's possible to make good sense of some of the wilder sounding things that, for example, Richard Rorty, who is, of course, I think a spokesman for a postmodernist climate, tries to present in his work. Rorty is fond of saying that truth is a matter, well, he's not really fond of truth at all, but insofar as he'll use the notion, he wants to say that proper discourse, something like truth, success in discourse, is a matter of coping, not copying. The idea is going to be that the notion of representation is somehow transcendental. The idea of language as representing the facts is somehow beyond our reach. He often says that the question, does he love truth, is equivalent to the question, does he love God with all his heart and soul? And that's a question which you can't know the answer to. It's not a good question. And this is part of his attempt, his campaign to replace the concept of representation or the concept of truth with a concept, a more Darwinian concept, like that of being adapted. So discourse becomes not susceptible so much of truth or falsity as useful or not useful. Also, politically, it becomes a question of whether a discourse is on the side of solidarity, whether it's, as it were, politically on the side of getting consensus and getting agreement with other people, as opposed to something else. Now, Rorty obviously is coming at the end of the kind of pressures I've just been mentioning. This is a philosophy you'd only get if you'd started to despair about any project of epistemology. And what Quine, Sellers, Wittgenstein and Kuhn, amongst many, many others, of course, were doing, in my brief account, was making us despair of any project of justificatory epistemology. What I want to do in the rest of the talk is try to bring together what I said about minimalism with what I've just done sympathetically, I hope, to place Rorty in a kind of post-epistemological climate, and one where he is responding to real problems, to real difficulties brought out by those great figures that I have mentioned. Because on the one hand, you've got sympathy, I think. I've got sympathy with Rorty, taking the problematic left us by people like Quine, Sellers, Wittgenstein, and Kuhn, taking that very seriously and trying to break out of the epistemological impasse that they leave by, in effect, denying the subject of epistemology, and doing that by denying the notion of representation. That sounds sympathetic enough. It sounds like a good move. On the other hand, you get him voicing himself by denying truth, by saying that truth only belongs to metaphysical prigs, by denying that we can make sense of Winston's predicament in 1984. That is, denying that Winston had a sensible thing to worry about when he worried about whether the party was, in effect, veiling his capacity or undermining his capacity to get at the truth about anything. And minimalism, it seems, ought to stop Rorty talking like that. Because, as I tried to explain earlier on, minimalism enables us to make perfect sense of Winston. It makes perfect sense of the question, does he love truth? And so it's very unclear why you should go Rorty's way, even as a way of expressing sympathy with the anti-epistemological writings, which undoubtedly form a large part of his background. Well, let me quote for you something, the kind of thing that Rorty likes to say, and then I'll say how I want to resolve this apparent tension, the apparent tension between sympathizing with Rorty, admiring him on the one hand for being a sensitive interpreter of the epistemological condition we got into as a result of those writings, versus thinking that he's just wrong about truth, that he's aligning himself with the old absolutist relativist kind of polarity, and that can be undermined by minimalism. So what are we going to say about this? Well, here's Rorty talking about coping but not copying. He says, there is no way in which tools can take one out of touch with reality. No matter whether the tool is a hammer or a gun or a belief or a statement, tool using is part of the interaction of an organism with its environment. To see the employment of words as the use of tools to deal with the environment, rather than as an attempt to represent the intrinsic nature of that environment, is to repudiate the question of whether human minds are in touch with reality, the question asked by the epistemological skeptic. No organism, human or non-human, is ever more or less in touch with reality than any other organism. Well, that's obviously a pretty provocative thing to say because, as we look around the coffee house, we're apt to see a lot of organisms which seem to be pretty out of touch with reality. But you can see how Rorty gets to say it. That is, okay, epistemology leads us into the Quine, Sellers, Wittgenstein, Kuhn impasse. It's a no-no, it's a non-starter, we can't do anything with it. Let's get rid of the notion of representation, which the epistemologist is desperately trying to certify, and see words in a more Darwinian sense as tools we have for coping, and then we leap free of the old problematic. We change the subject, as Rorty likes to put it. So Rorty walks away from the traditional problems as he sees it. And the walk away takes the form of junking a lot of the vocabulary, including the vocabulary of truth. Here he is on the replacement of representation with a vocabulary of solidarity. We understand knowledge best when we understand the social justification of belief, and thus have no need to view it as accuracy of representations. Instead of seeking vertical relationships between language or ourselves as language users and the world, we must concentrate upon horizontal or inferential processes whereby we advance and accept reasons from each other. justification becomes a social phenomenon rather than a transaction between a, and then inverted commas, knowing subject and, again inverted commas, reality. Well, now, that substitution, of course, coincides with realizing that contingently and historically situated as we are, any of the norms that govern the inferential relations that our peers will let us get away with are our norms. So the inferences that we produce are our inferences. Neither they nor anything else answers to the external world, except in the most general sense that they enable us to cope. And it's a foregone conclusion that a language will enable you to cope, because if it doesn't enable you to cope, you'll go to the wall and you won't be using it anymore. And that's basically the line of thought that leads Rorty to his rather more flamboyant kind of assertion, such as the one that truth is what your contemporaries let you get away with. A remark that excited Putnam's particular anger, because as Putnam rightly pointed out, there's more than a whiff of self-refutation in the air, since the remark that truth is what your contemporaries let you get away with wasn't one that Rorty's contemporaries let him get away with. Well, of course, to many of us, the solution looks worse than the problem. Whatever aporia people like Wittgenstein left us in, it looks as though the cure is worse than the disease if you get rid of the idea of language as, at least in part, there for representing the way of things. So can we, Rorty of course will say that shows a naive attachment to an old vocabulary, and it's part of his enterprise is to shake us up and to get us to abandon those thoughts. But as I say, I'm more of a prig and more conservative, and I want to keep hold of them. Rorty has, I think, two devices for sort of softening you up to his point of view. One is to insist that if you're still bothered about truth and objectivity, and this is, of course, a line of thought familiar at least since Berkeley, and always used by anti-realists or idealists against people with realist leanings, that the charge that they're attempting to stand on their own shoulder or adopt an Archimedean point outside their own best theory, outside their own world, to discover how well their theory is relating to reality, and pointing out that that point of view is mythical is one of Rorty's prime weapons, and of course he's quite right about it. The other, which is I think more interesting though, is the idea that you'd only be a realist, you'd only want to come back against his proposal to substitute talk of solidarity for talk of truth. You'd only want to resist it if you had a fantastical idea of the world as itself demanding to be talked about in one set of terms or another, as if the realist is involved in the very strange idea, naive idea, of the speaking world, the world which, as it were, has its own privileged vocabulary or privileged discourse. Obviously here the concern ties in with a dislike of scientism, because people who perhaps think of the world as having a privileged voice probably think that it's the voice of mathematics and the voice of physics. And one of the things that Rorty might be doing is plugging into a sense that at least other discourses have their own propriety. But on the face of it, it's very strange. It sounds as though you could be a card-carrying, paid-up believer in the notion of truth without thinking any such thing. If I'm interested in truth, as the minimalist construes it, then I'm interested in the schema, I believe P if and only if P, in maximizing the number of times that schema is satisfied or minimizing the number of times that I flout it. And it doesn't seem as though I'm interested in a talking world. I'm interested in a whole succession of things, like whether penguins fly, or whether geese lay eggs, or whether platypuses are mammals, or whatever it might be. And that doesn't require believing that the world talks. It just requires the capacity to make judgments about particular issues on particular occasions. Well, I think that's fair enough. There are other currents leading to Rorty, some of which I don't have time to go into this afternoon. One of them, of course, is the Salasian separation of the space of causes from the space of reasons. Rorty the motivation behind thinking that believers in truth, believers in epistemology, believers in objectivity, are stuck in some kind of naive conception of a talking world. I think the motivation behind believing that is the Salesian separation of the space of causes from the space of reasons. Rorty, like others like Brandom and McDowell, take that very seriously. And they think that therefore all your transactions with the world are purely causal. What enters your mind are just, as it were, energies from the flux. What your mind then does with that includes the making of experience itself, and of course the making of perception and the making of judgment, and so on. But that takes us into the space of reasons, and the space of reasons is not to be confused or even related to the space of causes. And that the idea would be that if you have the old epistemology, the old view of these things, which Rorty is trying to get us away from, it would be as if you thought that photons or other energies from the world came bearing messages. They came actually saying that there's a cat on the mat, or there's a cliff in front of you, or whatever it is. And the Salesian point is that they don't do that. This is a very impressive philosophy, and I think Rorty has pursued it with considerable skill, and it has, of course, relationships with similar philosophies found in writers like Robert Brandom, John McDowell, although McDowell is, I think, a more awkward case to place, and Donald Davidson. When Davidson says that only a belief can justify another belief, he's basically in exactly the same space as Rorty, although, of course, Davidson doesn't draw the radical consequences from it. How can we relate to this? How can we get a better view of it in such a way that the tension I talked about disappears? The tension being, remember, that we'll sympathize with Rorty if we remember the difficulties of epistemology, the difficulties heralded by Quine, Wittgenstein, Goodman, Kuhn, so on. Whereas we won't sympathize with him if we remember minimalism, because minimalism is going to keep us on all fours. It's going to keep our feet on the ground, and it's going to enable us to interpret things like he loves truth with all his heart and soul. It's not going to be a transcendental remark which you get to by jumping outside your own skin. It's going to be a perfectly ordinary, verifiable, empirical remark about the person's concern for satisfying that schema as often as possible. Well, I think there are ways of attacking Rorty which I think don't meet their mark, and it's very difficult to find one that does, partly because, as it were, as a dialectical posture, he's put himself in the rather enviable position of being able to say that almost anything you say against him just shows an attachment to a naive old vocabulary, whereas his whole point is to get you to stop thinking in those terms. And rather like David Lewis once said that he can't refute an incredulous stare, I think one can't refute somebody walking away with his back to you. So it is quite difficult. But I think we can see reasons for thinking that Rorty has got something wrong. Let me talk a little bit then about the Davidsonian side of it, the thought that only a belief justifies another belief, the thought that you need a total separation between the space of causes and the space of reasons. It seems to me that what's wrong with that Davidsonian slogan, and I'll bring this back to Rorty, is that it's not, I mean, it's obviously not true that only a belief justifies another belief. If you ask me why I'm justified in believing that there's butter in the fridge, the kind of answer you're going to get will probably include something like, I went and looked, or I listened to somebody who had gone and looked, or I've got this webcam trained on the fridge, and look, you can see the butter for yourself, or something like that. You won't hear me saying, oh, my justification for believing that there's butter in the fridge is that I believe that there's butter and cheese in the fridge, and a licensed inference in my society is from the presence of butter and cheese to the presence of butter. That's not the way it goes. Justification, as it's bandied about in the marketplace, is not a matter of what else you believe. If you imagine a mind which had the, as it were, self-fertilizing property of just beliefs bubbled up within it, although it was in no causal contact with an external world, well, actually, those wouldn't be beliefs. They wouldn't be, they'd be concepts without intuitions in Kantian terms. But playing along with the fantasy, that would be a self-contained mind, a mind which was just gifted with a surprising fertility in producing beliefs. But it wouldn't be a mind that was justified in believing anything, at least anything empirical, anything about the surrounding world, precisely because it wouldn't be the subject of a set of procedures which could be seen as making a belief more likely to be true than false, making it more likely that you believe P if and only if P than the reverse. What I think the Davidsonian slogan, which he takes from Sellers, he believes to be a kind of beefing up of something implicit in Sellers, what I think it forgets is that the causal flux, the things that cause you to believe things, are not themselves transcendental, they're not themselves outside the range of your beliefs. It's part of your everyday belief system that you're caused to believe that there's butter in the fridge by the presence of butter in the fridge. And furthermore, you can use that causal knowledge to put yourself in the way of causation, which in turn brings it about that your beliefs are indeed genuinely responsive to an external world. And with the idea of responsiveness comes at least part of the idea of representation. So I think what's happened here is that Rorty, Sellars, Davidson, people who think like that, have got themselves fundamentally into a position very like that which Berkeley got into when he was dissenting from Locke's epistemology. That is, of thinking that the only alternative to the Lockean idea of resemblance, the transcendental possibility that your ideas resemble the external world, the only decent alternative was to lock yourself in the world of your ideas altogether and let external reality disappear. I want to argue for a much more human, scaled down, not transcendental, re-injection of causation and responsiveness into the formation of beliefs in the first place. And I believe this is true to Kant. If we think about the speaking world element, I think we'll also see that Rorty has overplayed his hand. Those of us who believe in truth and believe in representation don't, I think, typically regard the world as demanding to be described in a certain way. We may have reasons for privileging physics, but those will be reasons that simply derive from things like physics utility or its fundamental place in explaining other things. It won't derive from the thought that physics is God's language or the world's language. You might have that thought, but you don't have to. Suppose I want to convince you of the representational credentials of a map of a landscape. I'll say, look, here is the sign representing cliffs. And you better jolly well pay attention to that because, for example, if you don't, you'll fall over the cliffs. If you're setting your compass bearing along there and you walk along there, look out, you're going to come to cliffs. Rorty will say that's an exercise of coping, of course. The map has a use, it's got a utility, and he's all in favour of utility. But then where's the contrast between coping and copying? Where's the contrast between the map enabling you to cope and the map representing the landscape? There's no contrast at all. The map does both things, and furthermore, common sense, human common sense, not anything transcendental, nothing about standing on your own shoulders, human common sense enables you to relate them. The map enables you to cope because it represents the lie of the land. If it didn't represent the lie of the land, it would be a miracle that it enabled you to cope. The map says the way it represents it is again given by minimalism. There'll be cliffs at point X if and only if the map says that they're cliffs at point X. That's what it is for it to be a good map. And you'll cope by expecting cliffs at point X better if you use the map than if, for example, you form the belief that there are or are not cliffs there in some random way. The map increases your chance of getting that sort of thing right. Well, those are very harmless platitudes about the representational properties of a map, but I think they can actually be generalized to the representational properties of language in general. What they do is tie the notion of representation to that of explanation, partly to that of response, as in causal cases, but partly to that of representation. My own favoured way, or it's only one way I think amongst many, of cementing that relationship would be to give something like what Frank Ramsey, the great early 20th century Cambridge philosopher, presented as a success semantics. That's a later title. He didn't call it success semantics. But the idea is that you can certify the representational power of a piece of vocabulary or a symbol on a map or anything else if you can say that there's a convention or habit of acting upon it, either in a single person or in a society, and the explanation of the success of people who so act upon it is, and then you disquote and point to whatever is represented. Let me give an example. Suppose the map has a little symbol of a church at a certain point on the map, and I say that symbol represents there being a church in Little Gidding, let's say, a village or something. The idea behind a success semantics is that the representational property of that symbol on the map is, as it were, certified, or perhaps it could be analyzed, if you like, analysis, into the idea that people acting upon that representation, people acting upon the fact of that symbol being at that place on that map, are typically successful in their actions when they are, because of something about the place of the church. That is, I go to the world and say that's why people who so act are successful. And that's what it is for the symbol on the map to express the place of the church. Now, I think such thoughts have a lot of steam in them and they've got a long way to go. You can tie them to adaptationist evolutionary explanations of the arrival of symbolism, or you can keep them free of that. They don't have to be tied into a teleosemantics, but they can fit in well with it. My point this afternoon isn't to try and defend such a semantics, although it actually has quite interesting repercussions for issues about debates about normativity and the reality of moral properties. But I'll leave those and go into them in the discussion period. My point this afternoon isn't to defend such a view. My point is to say that it's a perfectly naturalized, non-transcendental way of trying to bring together the space of causes and the space of reasons. It's trying to see concepts and reasoning as integrated with the idea of ourselves as embodied creatures whose essential way of being is acting in a physical space which surrounds us. And that, I think, is what a lot of postmodernism forgets. Davidson, I think, went wrong by wondering what justifies a belief. First of all, he asked it as a very abstract question, what justifies a belief? And then you get an answer, another belief, or something like that. I think that's as bad as Pilate's question, what is truth? If you want to know what justifies a belief, the right answer is which belief? You tell me which belief you have, I'll tell you what I can about what would justify it or what does justify it. What I tell you may not be sufficient, but then we'll have to argue it case by case. There's no general solution to the question of what justifies a belief. And eventually, given the way we are, what justifies our beliefs is going to have to relate to our embodiment in the world. In saying that, incidentally, I find myself very close to some of the things that John McDowell says in his book, Mind and World. It's just that I think that the way that John works them out is not actually correct in detail. So, we're not going to agree with the great postmodernist slogan made famous by Jacques Derrida, Il n'y a pas de hors texte. There is plenty outside the text. And I think learning that there's plenty outside the text is actually a lesson we could have derived from Wittgenstein. I think, if you remember Wittgenstein, the emphasis throughout the later philosophy is on our activities in the world. And it's precisely our activities in the world which I think enable us to get away from the separation of mind from world, which gave us the Rortyan difficulties. So, none of that makes epistemology a walkover. It doesn't enable us to turn the clock back, to undo everything in Sellers, to undo everything in Quine, to undo everything in Wittgenstein, to undo everything in Kuhn. It doesn't stop you, if you want to be paranoid, from agreeing with the royal butler that there are dark forces at work of which we know nothing. And of course often, especially in moral and social and political contexts, that's not a bad thing to worry about. So I'm not being a Pollyanna here. I'm not more optimistic about the what James called the human serpent than I think it deserves. But what I am optimistic about is the possibility of a philosophy which reintegrates truth and mind and world, and which enables us to take off the postmodernist inverted commas, so we can talk without blushing of truth, reality, objectivity, reason, experience. We might even talk about foundations, although that I think would be the topic for another talk. Well, thank you very much.